It should be almost there. That's what happens when you have rural broadband here.
We need to invest in broadband. That's another.
Yeah, I know. That's I feel so sorry for kids that don't have access. Yeah.
I know. All right, so we are live. We've got a few people watching already. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This has been one of our kind of most anticipated town halls, so I really appreciate everyone joining us. So welcome. We've got the next 60 minutes. We'll be tackling the climate crisis and what we can do about it. So first, I just want to start out kind of housekeeping, thanking everyone for my birthday fundraiser. It was my birthday on Thursday. We had a great time at the party. So thank you everyone that showed up and donated. And if you've missed the opportunity to donate, you haven't missed it. You can still do it on my website, www.addie4mn.com/donate. And you can still donate. That was a lot of fun. We ended up raising enough money to pay for our lawn signs, which is great. So if you have not signed up for a lawn sign, go ahead and do that on the website as well. And then if you have not signed up to volunteer, we'd still need volunteers. We will always need volunteers making those calls and doing direct voter connection. So that is on the website as well. So today I am really fortunate to be joined by Professor Peter Sorenson from the University of Minnesota and Representative Patty Acomb from Minnetonka, who is also the chair of the Climate Action Caucus. I was calling it a committee earlier, it's a caucus. These two are two of the leading experts in the state. So I will let them introduce themselves and we'll take your questions. If you've got questions that we aren't addressing, go ahead and put them in the comments on Facebook. I'll be monitoring those as we go as well. So Professor, let's start out with you if you want to give a little introduction.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm Peter Sorenson, and I've been at the University of Minnesota for about 30 years now. And I work mostly on I've worked in all kinds of issues. You may have heard of me actually out your way, Carver County. I worked on your climate problem a lot, and then founded the Invasive Species Center at the university. People may know me from that. But frankly, having spent the last couple years thinking about what I'm going to do with the rest of the time I have, I've decided that climate change is really the one issue that trumps absolutely everything. And so I'm focusing my efforts on climate change issues right now, particularly in water and fishes, because that's my expertise. But of course, everything's interconnected.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And Representative.
Well, thank you, Addie. I'm Representative Patty Acomb from the western suburbs, Minnetonka and Plymouth, and I am a new member to the Minnesota House and fortunate to be the chair of the Climate Action Caucus, which is a new group of legislators in the Minnesota House that are all focused on this really important issue of climate change and really how it impacts us in so many different ways. And so it's been an honor to be leading that group. My background is in natural resources. I have a degree from the University of Minnesota in fisheries and wildlife management. And it was back in the early 90s that I was over on St. Paul campus. And while I never had one of Professor Sorenson's classes, I do remember hearing about him. And so it was back in I think I graduated in 94. And so I think you were there then, but
I was.
Yeah. So I think I worked with Professor Ray Newman, and my husband, Craig Acomb, also went to the university and was, he taught or worked with Ann Kapuzinski. And so we have overlapping people that know one another, but it's a pleasure to be here today. Happy belated birthday to Addie, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So just to preface the conversation, we are beyond the point of deciding if climate change is real. It's real, it's happening. The question is, how bad is it and how do we stop it? So this conversation today is not going to be based on politics and if it's real or if it's not. We're talking about solutions and what we need to do going forward. This is probably one of the most impending doom kind of situations that we're in today, and something that we need to do something about. So I'm just gonna kind of give a little caveat, I guess, that I grew up here in Victoria, and we grew up fishing and hunting and walking on the nature trails and all that. And I remember with my dad, seeing water levels rising, seeing a change in where we were allowed to walk as kids. And we've always kind of talked about it, but I didn't realize how grave it really was until very recently. I took a little bit of time off after the last election when I was working on campaigns, traveled the world, and every stop that I was at, there was something that someone said that made me think that's because of the climate crisis. In Ireland, there was a tour guide near Cork that was giving us a tour of the castle where the Blarney Stone is. And they were saying they've never seen the river as high as it's ever been. And it was just raging. And then in Iceland, they were talking about the ice shifting around, and their rivers were the highest they'd ever been. And then in Hong Kong, they were talking about the smog, how terrible it was, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. In Bali, I arrived at a beach that was covered in plastic trash, covered. And I asked the gentleman that was there, you know, how does this get here? Who's cleaning this up? And he said it's from other countries, and just the way that the ocean and the tides was depositing all of that on this particular beach in Bali. And it was heartbreaking. So it is a global thing that's happening. It's not just here. It's not just in other places. It is everywhere. And it is impacting us right here in Carver County. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. A lot of local folks, especially those in the agriculture community, will understand when I say that we have struggled to find hay for our horses, that we've struggled, you know, to find any kind of good crops for livestock. And it's getting worse and worse every year. So there's little anecdotes that do affect everyone's personal day-to-day life. So it does affect you personally. So let's hop into that first question. We've had a couple pre-submitted ones. So the first one is, should we care about the effects of climate change on our lakes and our fish? So we'll start with Representative Acomb, and then we'll go to Professor Sorenson.
Great. Well, I think absolutely yes, we should care about the impact on our lakes and our fish. And I think, you know, Addie, you brought up a really great point, and that's that in our lifetime, I think this is becoming reality for so many people because we can see the changes in our lifetime. I think back to when I was a kid and the way it snowed in the winter. Our winters when I was young were very different than they are today. And so I think when we can actually see the change, it is more real. And so I think that can help us in some ways to motivate people to change. But I think as far as the impacts on our lakes, streams, rivers, without question, there's a huge impact. And I think, you know, I'm going to let the professor talk about the biology and all of that regarding the specifics of lakes. But I think that, you know, we see Minnesota is hotter and it's wetter now. So we have a lot of really extreme weather events, extreme rain events, 100-year floods, 500-year floods, and they're happening quite frequent. And so all of that water has to go somewhere. And so it is running off and taking nutrients and sediment with it. It's impacting the water quality of our lakes and streams. There are communities, and like in Mankato, I was at a conference there last year, and there was talk about the stream bank stabilization and how they are losing feet every year that are just sliding into the river. And so that all is having just catastrophic impacts on the water quality and the fish and macro invertebrates and vegetation, all of it. And so I think that it's hugely important. It's important on a number of fronts, environmental being one, public health being another. And so I'm really glad that we're having this conversation today, because it is one of the top issues in my world and in my heart. And so glad to be here talking about it.
Definitely. Professor Sorenson, go ahead.
Well, yeah, that's, boy, I'd be happy if you came back and gave a lecture for me. That sounds, you're right on the money. I think, you know, I'm just going to say I try and approach things from a scientific perspective, being a scientist, I suppose. So I'm just going to sort of tell an anecdote and then maybe give a few facts. And personally, I guess, of course, I've been, frankly, since my days, I won't tell you how long, over 30 years ago in graduate school, I've been preparing for this moment because the literature has been very clear about climate change. In fact, it goes back to 1903 and Svante Arrhenius, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on climate change in Sweden in 1903. and predicted exactly what we're seeing today. It's pretty extraordinary and frustrating as a scientist, but maybe people will wake up now, and that's great. And what really, I guess, caused me to kind of fully wake up, just personally, is I'm one of the few people in the state that works with what the state calls invasive carp, which are carp introduced from Asia, and they've been moving up the Mississippi River now, and frankly have recently crossed into Minnesota waters down near Genoa, Iowa. And the reason they crossed is because last year the river was so high that it was in constant flood stage. And when I saw that happen last year, not only was I frustrated, but very, well, I guess extremely frustrated, because I realized that climate change, like I said, is the overwhelming driver of everything. And everything we've been doing with invasive species is pretty pointless if all the rivers and lakes are going to flood into each other. And this becomes much more important than the invasive species issue, because in the case of many invasive species, it's what's driving it. So that's my little story. I'm going to finish my work on Asian carp. That's where the species came from, but I'm going to now focus on what's really driving their abundance and movement patterns, which is climate change, because anything else is not a good use of my time. So I'm just going to add a couple things that perhaps people haven't thought of in terms of waters in the state of Minnesota. And that is, we brought up the fact that the precipitation change is changing, and there are a lot more floods, and how serious that is. And that is indeed causing nutrients to flow into lakes in ways that are unmanageable. But in addition, there's considerable warming, which is occurring. And this is releasing, this is just basic chemistry, increased levels of nutrients from the sediments. So water quality is becoming increasingly uncontrollable, and will continue that way until climate change is addressed. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that it's driving water quality issues. No matter what the state spends on trying to reduce runoff, it's kind of pointless if we don't address this issue of warming and flooding. And the other issue that maybe I find people aren't really thinking about is, with increased CO2 in the atmosphere, it's causing acidification. And this is well known in the oceans. It's called ocean acidification, and it's being pointed to one of the reasons the coral reefs are diminishing. Same thing's happening in Minnesota. It hasn't been addressed. Our waters are being acidified for exactly the same reason. Carbon dioxide in water equals carbonic acid. So that's another thing that has to be addressed. And lastly, I just want to point out there are dramatic implications on the fish. As the temperatures warm, the water is no longer suitable for fish. And in particular, the one that comes to mind is walleye, our state fish. And that particular species cannot tolerate warm waters, and is indeed now documented to be disappearing from waters across Wisconsin. And I believe the same thing is happening in Minnesota. So we will lose our fishes, or at least the ones we value most. There's no doubt about it. This is just simple physiology. They will also get smaller, because as waters become warmer, they hold less oxygen, and you can no longer have large fish. So if there are people in the audience who value fishing and fisheries and water quality, these are all directly connected with climate change issues, and it's come to my attention the state isn't dealing with it, and I would sure be pleased if it did. So that's just my little spiel. But this is all basic science and chemistry that's been known for well over a century, that these things would happen like this. And it's just time to kind of, the day of reckoning is here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Come and gone, if you ask me. It's past time that the legislature take drastic steps to address this. I had the pleasure of working with Representative Bernardi on her carp bill. We called it the carp bill. It was the aquatic invasive species bill. Could certainly go further. And then she was also working on a salt bill for salt application. I guess the runoff with excessive salt from the roadways is really damaging our ecosystem.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
There's certainly measures we could take there.
those are all pretty serious things. But as the temperatures increase, like I said, it's just, I mean, I teach a class on it. It's fish have evolved to deal well with very narrow ranges of temperatures. They're cold-blooded. They can't put on jackets or sweat to change their temperatures or, go into air-conditioned rooms. They sit there in the lakes and they deal with it. And as the temperatures go up, frankly, a lot of them can't.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm just speculating now, but some of you maybe know that we've had a lot of problems with walleye in certain lakes like Mille Lacs, and it's not altogether impossible to imagine that warming climate has had something to do with that, and that we'll continue to see those things, which, of course, have great economic significance, particularly to some of the lake communities.
Right.
So need to bring some awareness of these water issues into it, the whole equation.
Definitely. Yeah. And we're fortunate here in this state that we have a really good partner in the DNR, who is, amicable to some of these changes. And, in my experience working with the Environment Policy Committee and the commissioners that we were working with, the commissioner and assistant commissioners, they're really acknowledging of this being an issue and cognizant of the travesty that it would be to tell a future Minnesotan, you can't walleye fish anymore because all the walleye are gone. So, we're fortunate that we have that good partner there. So let's move on.
If you don't mind me saying, I think it would be very wise to hire a few new scientists in the state.
Yes.
Because there really aren't any right now in the DNR or the university, or that are recent graduates that are. I'm a little past the past my prime, but somebody who's got a career ahead of them that can really make this a thing because it's needed. And I'm just throwing that out there. This is not just like a small issue. This is a long-term issue the state will face for the next few centuries.
Right.
So we need to more than just retool. We need to reconfigure ourselves.
Right. Yeah, I'm very pro-scientist everywhere. Let's get more, for sure. So let's move on to that second question. So I'm going to rephrase this. If we believe that it is impossible to stop global warming, are there still things that can easily be done to reduce its effects? I think and correct me if I'm wrong too, the science community has heartedly agreed that we are beyond the time where we need to take drastic action now. We'll talk about some clean energy initiatives in the 2030 versus 2050 in the next question here, but there are certainly things that we can do right now to address this, and on a personal level and on a state legislature level. So I don't know who wants to take that one first, maybe Representative Acomb?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. And I think that, just to circle back to the previous question for just a moment, and I think, Addie, you talk about the relationships that you've built with the DNR and your ability to understand the process. I think that just speaks to your readiness to be a senator. So it gives you really that experience that we need for somebody to hit the ground running. So I think that speaks volumes to your candidacy. And so when I think about this issue that we have with climate change, and I think, it's something that we all need to be involved in the solution. And there are things all of us can do. And I'm kind of in the camp where I'm still going to fight really hard to ensure that we minimize to our largest extent the implications from climate change. And so I'm not giving up on that. And so in that, I think there are all sorts of things that each and every one of us can do to help limit carbon emissions and also to help sequester carbon by, planting trees is a great one. And I think that's something we're going to talk about later, but that couldn't be a better solution in that we all can do it. And it's probably the least expensive of all. But I think that, we can all do things to our homes and where we live to make them weatherproof. And so we use a lot less electricity to heat and cool, that we have good insulation to prevent any escape of our heating and cooling. And, I think that we can easy things from changing light bulbs and using energy efficient appliances. And I think, oftentimes we talk about climate change in these kind of really large topic areas, and that they're really kind of not tangible. And so it's difficult for people to feel as though they can have an impact in the solution. And it truly is, from, buying electric vehicles or driving less and walking more. We have communities that are working hard to build bikeable and walkable areas so that people don't have to drive. Building out our transit system is another great way, and to keep people off the roads and individual cars. And so I think, from looking at our homes and transportation and our purchasing, I think that we all can play a part in that solution.
Absolutely. Yeah. Professor Sorenson, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, that all sounds great to me. Again, remember, I'm looking at this from sort of a more of a subject, I guess, a scientific kind of perspective. But this is sort of my sort of take a little bit. And that is, since 1860 to today, the average global temperature has risen about 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. In Minnesota, it's been twice that amount, basically because of how wind patterns go. Well, that's probably primarily it, actually. And furthermore, there's been the amount of CO2 released in the atmosphere has been calculated, and how much has been absorbed in the oceans. And even if we were to stop releasing more CO2 today, there's undoubtedly another degree plus of warming to come. It's already in the works. It's just because it's already in the oceans. The oceans maintain 60% of the released carbon dioxide in the world, and it's there, and it's sort of coming for us. So yes, I think we have to prepare and reduce the amount and everything, but meanwhile, there's this amount coming, unfortunately. It's there, it can be calculated, it's well known, and it's coming. And so there, I guess I'll just say one thing, and that's sort of a pet thing of mine, really, and that is I'm extremely concerned for the 10, 11,000 lakes of the state and the fishes within it and the economies that rely on it. And we've already seen dramatic effects with this 1 degree Celsius warming. Another degree, it's going to be even harder on these systems. And they're already overtaxed, many of them. And it's well established in the scientific literature that healthy, robust ecosystems are much more resilient to any kind of stressor placed on them, whether it be temperature in this case, or temperature and pH, which is actually the case. So what I would like to, excuse me if I'm advocating a little bit, but I think it's time to turn our attention a little bit, just as we have for land. Like, I'm sitting in a state park right now. We have 60-something state parks, 160 scientific and natural areas. Not one of these is devoted to water or aquatic life. And these systems, these aquatic systems, are extremely threatened right now. And I would like to advocate for creating more protections for these systems, Lake Itasca in particular, at the headwaters of the Mississippi, because if we can protect them from invasive species and increase development beyond the level that we have right now, beyond that, and for the explicit purpose of climate change, maybe there's a chance they'll be there with the degree of temperature rise that we're expecting in 30 to 40 years. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm advocating for, is increasing resilience in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, particularly aquatic ecosystems, because they've been largely ignored. They've been treated on a very piecemeal basis. Mm-hmm. And so that's something we very much can do. And it has been done in the oceans. I teach marine biology too. There are almost 15,000 protected areas in the world's oceans now. And it's time to take our freshwaters as seriously as people take actually ocean water, and do the same thing in Minnesota while we have that chance. And unfortunately, yes, I think we have to absolutely reduce CO2 emissions and increase in sequestering, et cetera, et cetera. That's something you're doing for 30 to 40 years now, but for the next 10 to 20, there's a considerable lag, and it's going to warm, and we're going to use walleye and all this kind of stuff. So I really think, let's put it this way: if I was in the legislature, maybe you can now, that I would advocate for that very, very strongly. I don't see adequate protections for aquatics for any number of reasons, and not explicitly for climate change, because that is the primary threat. We do have legislation for, water quality and nutrients and fishing, development, all these things, but those are all part of the other issue. And I think it's time to focus on the elephant in the room, basically, because it's there. And that does shift in how we manage and think about things as a state.
And Representative, I know we've worked, your caucus has worked a lot on initiatives around this. Did you want to comment on any of those?
Well, I just wanted to respond to the professor and say, let's write a bill for that. I would love to meet offline and see if we can put some language together that we can submit next session about protecting our lakes. So give that some thought.
I'd be thrilled. Send me an email, or I'll send you one, and we'll see if we can do it. I've actually started writing mock bills to do this.
Great.
Like, I've been studying what's been happening in the oceans a lot, and I think it can just be applied out here at zero cost, and it would protect and enhance many of our fisheries, and it would just keep things for future generations.
Well, it looks like you can have an advocate in the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate when we get
that would be
Addie
wonderful.
elected, and there you go. So we'll
Yeah.
circle back on that after the election.
Yeah, I might have to fight Senator Friends for that one, but I will. Yeah. I cannot wait to sign up to be on their version of the Climate Action Caucus.
Yes.
So
yes.
appreciate that.
Or just let me know. Yeah.
I'm in. Yeah.
Okay.
So our third question that I'm very excited about, that was submitted, I believe, by the Carver County MN350. Thank you all for submitting these great questions. A statewide goal of 100% clean energy by the year 2050 was passed by the Minnesota House and supported by the governor. It is also similar to Xcel Energy's own timeline for adopting 100% renewables. But it did not even receive a committee hearing by the Senate. Do you support this goal? This is to me. Do you support this goal? And what steps would you take as a senator to get this bill passed? So to preface this, the committee process has to happen. And I talk about it every week that we see a dereliction of duty. We see Senate who's not hearing bills, who's not having hearings, who's not vetting these things and coming together to find creative solutions that are the best thing for Minnesotans. And we need to change that. And if that means sending a, feisty redhead from Carver County in there to do it, then let's get it done. With that hearing process needs to happen. That's how we come up with the best bills. So I would absolutely support that bill. I believe it was Jamie Long's this year and Senator Friends as well. So I would sign on as a co-author. I would chief author it if someone else wasn't taking it already. And I would absolutely help shepherd it through the process. But Representative, do you want to comment on our version?
I would love to. Yeah. So I think that, this was a great bill. And I think the science even tells us now this isn't fast enough to many of the points that Professor Sorenson has talked about. But it's a really important bill to pass. And I think it's amazing that sometimes in the lack of leadership, other people can step up. And so we're seeing industries and businesses make these pledges because they know that this is something that Minnesotans value. They want renewable energy. They want us to decrease our dependence on fossil fuels. And so Xcel Energy has made the commitment, and so many other businesses have as well, like Cargill and General Mills and Best Buy and Target, and they're doing it because it's important. Not only it can save them money, but it can also, it's good for their brand, and people want to buy and be customers of organizations that are looking at things in a responsible and resilient and sustainable way. And so it was super frustrating and disappointing that the Senate wouldn't hear the bill, and especially with how much support we have for it and how much communities are asking for it. And, you know, you Excel and their commitment to being 100% renewable by 2050, they are, because of the cost savings of renewable energy, they are asking to have a coal holiday. So not burn coal in the spring and the fall. And they have to go to the Public Utility Commission to get authority to do that. But they're doing that because it saves ratepayers money. And so we are at a point in time that renewables are not only good for our environment, but they're also good for our economy. And so I think that the bill makes absolute sense, and believe me, it will come back. And I look forward to working on it together with you.
Yes, absolutely. Can't wait. Professor Sorenson, did you want to weigh in on that one?
I'll just add a tiny bit.
Sure.
You know, basically, I should also mention some of these numbers I'm getting it from a book by Peter Kalmus, Kalmus, who was a professor at Caltech who wrote a book on global warming. But anyway, according to him, 24% of the world's CO2 is coming from electricity and heating. So I'm just looking at it from that perspective. And if it's that much in Minnesota, which probably is, then it would be helpful to have a CO2 budget for Minnesota. Then, of course, this is worth doing, because that's, you know, that's worth the effort if that's a quarter of where it's coming from. And of course, it's easily done. I mean, frankly, wind technology and solar technologies come a very, very long way, and creates jobs. So, of course, yep.
Absolutely. Yep. I think any energy conversation that we have has to include that jobs piece. That makes you feel a little bit better about things, and it's creating jobs and putting people back to work, especially now at a time where we really are going to need that moving forward. So, all right, the next question, mass transit provides for efficient travel, reduces emissions, and encourages economic growth while providing low-income communities with affordable means of daily mobility. How will you prioritize funding for public transit expansion in the district and in the state? So I'm not sure of how much travel you guys have done out in Carver County. There's not a lot of public transportation options out here. Slowly getting better. I know the Met Council has put some investments out here. Just selfishly, as someone who works at the Capitol every day, if I got to ride a bus, I would be so happy. And I know there's a lot of us that live out here that choose to live out here for the quiet and the beauty, really, and work in the city. So just from a convenience standpoint, I believe that needs to happen. When that expansion happens, I think it also needs to be, clean energy, the green buses. Frank Hornstein, the chair of the Transportation Committee in the House, did a lot of great work with Scott Dibble, Senator Dibble, on green public transit. And that work needs to continue and be a priority as well. Professor Sorenson, we'll start with you and then go to Representative Acomb.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Again, I'm just going to, well, the way I approach things, I just look at the numbers, really. And I did, for this talk, thank you for inviting me again. I really appreciate it. Actually, it's not only interesting, but it forced me to look some deep numbers up. So I can just tell you that the average car with a person driving by themselves per mile produces 0.45 kilograms of carbon dioxide per mile. A train is 0.14 and a bus is 0.06. So there you are. So if you had mass transit, you could reduce the CO2 emissions by the state. At least you could reduce it by 3/4 or perhaps more fairly easily. So I guess to me that's just a pretty simple case. And of course, it would again add jobs and opportunities and so forth. So, yeah.
Representative?
Yeah, I will say that building out our transit system is vital on all sorts of fronts. I think the environment and climate issue is certainly one of them. And I think it's also a talent attractor. I think young people today don't want to own cars. I have two young men, sons, 18 and 20, and truly they would love to live in a city where they do not have to own a car. They prefer to be able to use public transit to get around. And I appreciate that about them and about the next generation. And so I think in order to be a competitive community, we need to build out our transit system, and it has incredible benefits to our environment and the climate. And in the last question, Professor Sorenson was talking about the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that come from the energy sector, and actually the largest sector greenhouse gases come from transportation. And so it's really important that we work to build that system, that transit system out. Before coming to the Minnesota legislature, I was on the Minnetonka City Council and was there while we approved to have the Green Line extension, Southwest Light Rail, come out to the suburbs, which will be ending not quite in Victoria, but almost there in Eden Prairie. And so that will be able to get people from Eden Prairie and anywhere in between to the Capitol, to the airport. And that doesn't have a built out system. It needs to be supported by bus to do regional circulators routes to help that system. But the whole concept of transit is vitally important to our community for so many reasons. And I think it's really important that we have sustainable ways to pay for it. And, you know, we've got a bonding bill at the legislature this year, and it's really important that we get that bonding bill passed. And as Addie commented on earlier, it's because we need jobs right now in our community with everything that's going on with the pandemic. This bonding bill is such an important way that we can invest at really cheap interest rates in our communities. And so I think in 2019, we also had suggested a transit tax for the metro communities. And so I think there are ways that we need to have some sustainable funding that can allow us to build these out to be what our community needs in order to be resilient and grow. And so I think it's important on just so many ways.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And
I just add one quick thing, and very simple. My wife just retired a few months ago, and one of the things that frankly motivated her to retire was the horrible traffic.
Mm-hmm.
So I just don't think our reliance on cars is really sustainable if the Twin Cities are going to remain a viable place for people to live and companies to come in and all that kind of stuff. So it makes sense from carbon dioxide, absolutely. It's just a no-brainer, mm-hmm. But also from, I guess, the other issues.
Well, and Professor, you bring up a really great point. I think that, you know, during the global pandemic of COVID-19, and so many people have been working from home and not driving, we've seen communities all across the globe that have cleaner air, and they can see stars where they didn't see stars before because of air pollution and smog from cars and other forms of pollutants. But in Los Angeles, for example, they have the air has cleared. Now, when the pandemic is gone, we will probably go back to life as it was before with driving, and it will, you know, come back the way it was. But it shows me how changing behaviors and changing sectors can have a real dramatic impact on the health of our planet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'd like to see some investments in infrastructure for clean cars. I've spoken with, in my work with Chair Purcell up in Bemidji, I want to say his stepdaughter, something, was trying to buy a clean car and had to drive, you know, almost 100 miles to go find one, even to try. So to have those more readily available on dealership, you know, lots, and then having the charging stations all around on our major highways, I think would be a fantastic small step that we could do towards electric cars. And I know that's really supported by the governor.
Well, the governor's working on his rulemaking for the clean car standard, and that will set in motion so many different changes in our state. It will point to the car dealers who are going to say that, oh, people are going to be buying these, and so they're going to keep them on their lots, and they're going to be more available. And it is really important with the Volkswagen settlement money that MPCA has been working to build out that charging infrastructure so that people I think there's something, I'm not a transportation expert, but I think they talk about range anxiety, and people are nervous about getting an electric car because they aren't sure it's going to fit into their lifestyle and if they will be able to find charging stations to be able to charge when needed. And so the more we can build out that system, the more people will invest.
Absolutely. All right, so the next question is one very near and dear to my heart, just having grown up on a farm and in ag my whole life. So farmers are increasingly feeling the crunch from climate change, from wet springs to late season dry spells to heavy snow and rain events that damage crops. Do you support funding for the University of Minnesota Forever Green program, researching innovative crop and land management practice to mitigate these challenges? I was really fortunate to work on both the Higher Education Committee and the Environment Policy Committee, so I got to see this quite a bit. And then Representative Tabke, who I also work with, is on the Ag Committee. So I've had a lot of conversations around this Forever Green program, and I do support it. The funding mechanism for it is a little wonky. I'd like to see that cleaned up a little bit, but absolutely supporting that. I also think in addition to that, we need immediate aid to farmers that are willing to make transitions now and explore new crop opportunities or new methods. There's a lot, especially around here, that are innovative and looking for ways to kind of save the family farm and willing to make those changes. We need to have the immediate support from the state legislature there for them as well. Let's go with Professor Sorenson and then back to Representative Acomb.
Oh, well, sure. Well, I guess I am somewhat familiar with the Forever Green program, and yeah, it's a really good, solid effort to diversify, as far as I can tell, the farming industry, which is really under a lot of stress. I appreciate a little bit, anyway, kind of understand a little bit what farmers must be going through. It's very difficult. And so I absolutely support that. And it would be wonderful if we could diversify farming in Minnesota to sort of address more of the climate change issues, which is, not, it's not front and foremost now, but it would be important to move it there because, frankly, analyses of carbon dioxide production have very strongly pointed to industrial farming as a big issue, not only because of how they're turning over the land, but the machinery involved, and then, of course, reliance on the types of animals that they have. It's a big source of greenhouse gas, but this can all be adjusted and changed. And I think that's great to look at that and expand upon that. And if you can solidify the funding, which I'm not familiar with, for like a lot of funding for a lot of environmental initiatives, Forever Green apparently suffering from some inconsistencies there, that would be a wonderful thing to do and a great step to make.
Representative?
Yeah, so I have only become familiar with Forever Green since being at the legislature the last couple of years, but I think it's an amazing program. And, here in Minnesota, we have this very long and rich tradition of farming. And so I agree that we need to do whatever we can to kind of support that. And my mom, while we didn't farm it, my mom had farm land that she rented. And so I have, a very limited understanding of farming and kind of some of the traditions, or some of the practices. And so I think the things that I think are so beneficial about Forever Green are really diversifying our crops instead of being so dependent upon corn and soybeans, that if we can have other crops that farmers can get involved in. And in order to kind of support that, we really need to have markets for them to sell it to. And I sit on the Clean Water Council, and Forever Green came and did a presentation to us about Kernza and some of the other products that they are encouraging to be tested and grown here in Minnesota, and that they're being very deliberate kind of about being able to start markets in a few different areas to be able to supply the growers with what they need, and then have a place for them to sell their product in the end. And instead of just kind of making it, come what may, they're trying to be deliberate about it. And I think that can be helpful. I think that sometimes doesn't always move very quickly, which I think we can all get a little impatient with. But I think if the more we can do to help support farmers and encourage behaviors that really circle back to good soil health, I think is better for all of us. And I think there's a lot of best practices that are supported by Forever Green. They look for no-till, and that certainly helps for so many things, and perennial and cover crops, and the impacts that we know that kind of lend to soil health and also have a positive impact on water quality. And so I do think we need to help support our farmers. And so I am certainly supportive of this. And I know that farming can have it can be a real strain and a trouble. And yet we need farmers because we need food. And so I think it's a really important initiative.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We just got a comment I want to read from the Facebook from Arlen Brinkmeyer, who is running for the House seat, 47A side. Awesome guy. Please look him up if you have not. He said a program, I guess his parents have a small dairy farm, and then he works in the egg industry as well. So he said a program to help farmers transition from row crops is vital as farmers continue to plant corn and soybeans at break even at best. And in a lot of cases, a loss because of the logistics of doing anything is scary and daunting. So absolutely agree with Arlen on that one. All right, so next question, I'm going to rephrase a little bit too. What can the legislature do to protect the most vulnerable people among us from health impacts of climate change, such as heat-related illnesses, asthma, cardiovascular disease, increased severity of COVID-19, and pregnancy risks which disproportionately affect Black people and communities of color? Some of you that are watching may have tuned into the Environment Policy Committee informational hearing that we had. Former Representative Karen Clark is championing a bill. And that was kind of the first real testimony that I had seen relating to this. It's a very significant problem, data supported as well. So Representative Lee had some permitting bills that were aimed at adding another layer of kind of a demographic analysis to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's permitting process. They're great as well, and I would support those. And then one thing I want to mention too that I was just shocked by is when Representative, you were on this trip as well when we went up to Bemidji and toured around, and we were on the bus touring the Leech Lake Reservation right around there, and they were talking about the Superfund site where essentially a company had been soaking like kind of flame retardant chemicals onto railroad ties and lumber and letting it seep into the ground. And it had gotten so bad, and then, removing trees and not having any cover, and then the dust was so bad that the company that was doing that had to go into people's homes. And it was mostly indigenous communities in their homes to clean out the dust. And it ended up being so bad that they had to block off part of their sacred land right around the lake there just for health reasons. That's, a travesty. I can't even get over it. So any environmental or health related legislation has to have that lens of, demographic analysis or, situational race, whatever it might be, analysis. It's been proven over and over again that there's, higher COVID-19 deaths when a person has previously been exposed to air pollution. And there was a federal report, I want to say in 2018, where low-income communities have higher health concerns, are exposed more to environmental hazards, take longer to recover from natural disasters. That has to be a consideration. So there's a few things that we can do there. And Representative, I can let you, expand on those a little bit more of anything that we have been working on and what we can continue to do and what I can continue to do as a senator.
Well, I think that you hit a lot of the high points, and I just think that, here we are again, where the least among us have the biggest impacts, and so many times we're seeing that in, our education disparities and our education gap, and it happens in health, and here we are on the climate. and larger impacts for low income and communities of color. And it just, I think that it's so important that we are very intentional and deliberate in our actions to remedy the problems. And I think that I sadly I had to leave early from the trip in Bemidji, and so I wasn't with you guys at Leech Lake. But I was at the hearing and heard from former member, I'm forgetting your name now.
Karen Clark.
Thank you, Karen Clark. And that was very powerful and very meaningful. And I think that I had some great conversations with Representative Kali Her, who is authoring a bill or introduced a bill this session around cumulative impacts. And it's really looking at the demographics, as Addie alluded to, and those demographics can be about race and income level and age and health, and really looking at all of them when deciding about a permit, instead of just saying, nope, we're going to look at this one project in isolation and ignore everything else that has happened before in that area to that group of people. And I think that it is time that we take responsibility for the actions that we have and the impacts they have on people and on communities. And so I think that we need to be very deliberate and we need to be very intentional. And the bills that you referenced are certainly things that I support, and am hopeful that will be brought up again next session.
Absolutely. Professor, if you don't mind, we're a little short on time, and I want to get your opinion on the next question.
That's fine. It's not.
Okay.
I'll just say one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a clear absence of, I don't know what, minority people in the natural resources and climate change areas in general at all levels. I mean, we don't hardly get any applying to the university. We hardly have any money to support them.
Mhm.
I think this might be something the legislature could consider, empowering folks to understand the world they live in a little bit better, so they can move up and get the educations and roles that they deserve and need in these things. And it's a long time, but I think it's a kind of a piecemeal approach. I know the university is doing the best it can, but it can only do so much. It needs to be more of it might help if there was sort of more of a top-down thing from grade school. I mean, that's where you turn kids on, right? All the way up.
Mhm.
I'm just my point, and I think that would be wonderful. Yeah, and very positive and helpful. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So second to last question here, deforestation in the Amazon is occurring to make way for farming. This means buildup of carbon in the air for breathing here in Minnesota. To counter this dramatic loss of carbon sequestration by disappearing trees in the Amazon, what do you recommend we do here in Minnesota and in Carver County to promote more carbon sequestration right here? Credits for leaving land fallow or planting cover crops, requiring every city and county to develop a specified amount of acreage for planting trees, etc. So I had the great pleasure of working on a bill we ended up calling the Lorax Act. Unfortunately, did not go anywhere in the Senate. Again, shocking. But it was a bill that was carried by Chair Purcell. Representative Lippert also had a carbon sequestration bill. So kind of similar. The Lorax Act was basically to replace any forest land that was converted permanently into something else, whether it be building or ag or whatever, within the same watershed district, which was really important, very interesting to learn about. So I am looking forward to championing that, continuing on, and Representative Lippert's carbon sequestration bill as well. Is there anything else, Professor Sorenson, that you think local cities, counties could do, or something else that we could do at the legislature to encourage reforestation?
No, that's a great, I hadn't heard of that, but that's a wonderful thing to do. And of course, it's hard to criticize a country like Brazil if we're not any better ourselves. So it's important to set a role model. Obviously, saving an acre of tropical rainforest is frankly more valuable than saving an acre in Minnesota. But still, if it's what you can do, it's what you can do, and you've got to set show some leadership here, which, frankly, we haven't done a very good job of recently. So no, I think that's great. I just wanted to add, preparing for this, I looked at a little bit how much land you have to put aside, and I think it's useful to have those numbers when you create these bills. And in the state of Minnesota, you need about 3 acres of forest to make up for what one person's present carbon footprint is. Now that could and should be reduced. That's what we have to work on. But that gives you sort of a target goal. And of course, not losing carbon sequestration opportunities, just like not losing wetlands. I mean, they're equally important. And that makes a lot of sense. And forest is clearly more important than grassland, for instance. So these things can be quantified. The science is there. And the legislature might want to take a look at it so you get the best bang for your buck kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And it's, better with stronger justification. But yeah, I think that's really smart. We should be saving these forests. Frankly, just like I said earlier, we should be saving these lakes that we have. I mean, really saving them, mm-hmm. not just using them less or building fewer houses on them, but really saving them.
Right. Active help.
Active, yeah. For the purposes of climate change, because we know it's here.
Yeah. Representative, do you want to comment on those bills or any others?
Only that, no, I think those are both really great examples of opportunities that we have. And I fall back to the fact that planting trees is something that everybody can do. And it's really one of the least expensive remedies. And so it's an important tool in the toolbox.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, we've got time for one last question. I do want to read one of these comments here from Mr. Dan Tangwell, who I actually am going to call soon. My main hope for an area that I care about, veterans and veterans benefits, could be at risk of losing funding for the state veteran homes because of the challenges of COVID-19. Will Addie commit to fully funding veterans programs? So not related to climate change, I just wanted to comment, yes, absolutely. And I'm really excited to talk with you about that offline. So, all right, last question. How have we seen the climate crisis affect hunting and what can we do to help? So this is very near and dear to my heart as well, having grown up as a hunter. I'm gonna let you guys in on a little secret too. Bird hunters, probably a lot of us, myself included, my dad included, get into it for the dogs. I didn't really intend to be a hunter. My dog just loves hunting, so I'm a hunter now. And my dad was the same way. He was a big fisherman, fishing every weekend. He was born and raised in Indiana and moved here for my mom, but he says it's for the fishing. So to get him to switch from fishing to hunting, or include both rather, was through the dogs. So, we've seen a lack of the climate crisis has affected hunting in the lack of available birds now to hunt. There's less eggs, there's less cover, there's less safe places for them to grow up. So we're having to travel further and further and further out to find the same birds that we used to be able to get right down the road here. There's higher temperatures now, so you can't hunt the dogs as long. You're going to have to take more breaks. And I have a Gordon setter who's darker black color, so really have to be careful with that. And then there's, anytime we make it harder or more difficult to find good hunting land and good game that we can hunt, you're discouraging involvement for our youth. And I just hate to see that. So there's, initiatives in the House and I believe in the Senate, but probably didn't really go anywhere with non-toxic shots. So this was all more of a carrot versus stick approach. So Representative Becker Finn carried a lot of these bills, and it was to encourage people to use non-toxic shot or non-toxic fishing tackle. When you take the hunter certification class, you're getting a $15 gift certificate to use or a coupon or something. So a lot of these encouragement bills so we can avoid lead poisoning in our raptor population, like Representative, you had that bill for the funding for that. And some of the younger generation of hunters and fishermen and fisherwomen are cognizant of this. I was just speaking with my brother and his buddies the other day about non-toxic fishing tackle. He knew exactly where it was, exactly how much it costs, and said we need to have more of it. I know the hunting community is in agreement with that too. There's a little bit of a cost with that, but that's fine. It's a little thing that we can do that makes a big difference. So I don't know, Representative, do you want to comment on those bills? Or?
Yeah, you know, I think certainly it's important to ensure that when people are hunting and fishing, they aren't harming the environment. Because I truly think that those people that do hunt and fish are true conservationists and want to care for the land. And so the lead shot bill that I had was really around just offering education to hunters and fisher people who fish to use alternatives to lead because of the impacts on our raptor population. And so I think that if we can provide education, if we can provide opportunities for people to do better, they will do better. And I think, you know, back to Professor Sorenson's point that there aren't a lot of people who work in natural resources that are people of color. And I think it's concerning that fewer people are hunting and fishing. I think the one kind of silver lining I saw or I've heard about during, again, COVID-19 was that they've sold like way more fishing licenses this year than they have in other years by this time. And so I'm hopeful that, you know, maybe there can be some return to some of the simpler things in life that can get people to enjoy the outdoors, because it's so important to our mental health and I think those people who appreciate the environment want to protect the environment. And so, you know, I think the whole impact on hunting is wide ranging. And so I think it certainly needs a little attention.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Professor Sorensen, did you want to add anything?
Well, you kind of covered it. I mean, you know, as the climate warms and acidifies, the lakes dry up and move, and there's less food for things, and there are fewer birds, and invasive species affect that. That's all very well documented. It's crystal clear. And the forests are moving, I don't know if you know, but almost half a mile a year to the north. That's how fast this climate is changing right now. That fast. You can almost see it, which is unprecedented, by the way. No period in the Earth's geological history has ever seen warming at this speed. Mm-hmm. So this is a very serious thing. And of course, fishing will particularly be affected because fish can't move, like fly between lakes or anything like that. They're stuck in those lakes. And as they warm, this is why I'm so concerned about it. They're just going to perish or maybe be replaced with an invasive species. It's very dire. And I believe. And, you know, hunting, a similar scenario, as you just said, with forests moving, and for waterfowl, it's waterfowl are water, so similar issues. So I just wanted to add one final point. It's just something to think about, and that is, this is obviously a really complex issue, climate change, and it's really overarching. I mean, that's the thing that I've discovered. It kind of spans from water chemistry and water quality, hydrology, physiology of fish and animals, and carbon dioxide. So it's sort of a very big overarching thing. Very few people, and I put myself in that category, are really equipped to deal with this. It's sort of a relatively new area, and I would think it might be a smart idea. I don't know how you'll ever fund it. But again, I'm sort of an idealistic kind of person. But if it were possible for the state to create some kind of environmental center that it might be housed in DNR or MPCA or somewhere that was an overarching kind of approach, not just in fisheries, not just in wildlife, not just in water quality. I mean, this is what the problem is right now, but that connects all these things somewhere, somehow, and maybe had an educational component that actually worked with kids in schools. And I don't mean just the university, by the way. I mean grade school kids. That's where kids really learn to love the environment and understand it and appreciate it. Absolutely. And it so often strikes me when I just an observation, but often when I go downtown Minneapolis, I'll sometimes talk and say, oh, I'm going to go out to a lake or hunting. And a lot of people living in the city have no idea. They look at me cross-eyed. They've never been out. It's only 5 miles away. So there's a need to kind of, for Minnesota to look introspectively and look at its heritage, I think, if we're going to survive as a strong state. And because that was our strength, it still is, and reestablish that. And climate change is also an opportunity that it could unify. Anyway, I'll get off that bandwagon. I just wanted to put that idea out there. because I think right now, if you were to ask any particular biologist in the state, whether it be at the university or the DNR, they would struggle to deal with it because we only see, like you, one tiny piece of the pie.
Absolutely.
We need someone who's full-time job to connect it, the economics, the water flows, everything. Atmospheric science, it's climate science, it's everything. And they do have these people, but not around here. And I think that's what we really need. Don't need a lot of them. It doesn't have to be super expensive, but just an idea. So anyway,
yeah,
that's my last hurrah. Thank you for letting me say it.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And I constantly talk about, building coalitions and bringing the experts to the table. It's not up to one representative or one committee. It's up to all of us to bring everybody to the table and come up with these creative solutions and have all the voices there. That being said, I would love to see a senator, representatives from Carver County bring our unique voice to the state capitol. I think someone who was born and raised in
That would be great.
Hunting and fishing and hiking these trails can speak to a very specific Carver County voice, and I intend to be that voice. So Representative Acomb, since we're about out of time, any closing comments?
No, I really just want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation today. You brought up just some really important things that we all need to be thinking about, talking about, and working on. And I just also want to say that, Addie, you are the right person at the right place at the right time. And you've got like you say, the background, the experience, the knowledge at the Capitol. You would be a fabulous senator. So I'm thrilled to be here today supporting you. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate that. Professor Sorenson, any last closing comments?
Other than what a privilege it has been to speak with you about this. And I support everything you said. And I really, whatever. You have my support. I meant to say that as a scientist. And I don't live in Carver County, but somebody has to stand up and do this. And I think you'd be a great one.
Yeah.
It really, really, really is important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we are blessed in this county too to have some of the most active youth climate strike folks out here. So we've got a really good coalition of people going out here.
Great.
So thank you both so much for your time, your expertise, and everything. Anyone who's watching, if you have further questions, please reach out to me on social media, email, text, call, whatever it might be, and I will get back to you as soon as I can.
And you can contact me too. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll see you same time next week.
Take care. Bye now.
Okay, take care. Bye then.